Are you thinking about moving to the U.S. East Coast to live? Well, this episode might make you question whether you should do that or not. We're going to talk about it on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Now, today's episode, we're going to be talking about what's happening on the U.S. East Coast. There was a paper that was just published on January 2nd, and it was by the Virginia Tech and the U.S. Geological Survey. And it basically says that major cities on the U.S. Atlantic coast are sinking. In some cases, as much as 5 millimeters per year. Now, you may say, hold on, that's not very much, Andrew. 5 millimeters is not that bad. But when you think of it per year and the ramifications of that, especially when it comes from areas that are high in infrastructure, you're looking at something that's pretty major in this regard. And so you should be listening to this if you're on the East Coast, if you live by the coastline, and you're thinking of buying near a city along the East Coast. We've seen storms that have come through, major storms that have come through that have completely flooded these areas. And when we're talking about this study, and I'll go through the details in just a second, we're talking about just the land sinking. We're not talking about sea level rise. This has nothing to do with sea level rise at this point. It's not even accounting for sea level rise, which is increasing as these pieces of land are decreasing or these areas are decreasing. So it's a pretty big deal when this comes out. And as the authors say at the end, nobody's really doing this type of work. Nobody's looking at this. And this can impact a lot of infrastructure and cost a lot of money in the future. I'm going to put the link in the show notes, as I normally do, for this phys.org article. I highly recommend that you take a look at it because it has some great maps of where these areas are majorly impacted. But I'm going to go through it right now just to look at it. It says the areas that are going to be sinking the most, like up to 5 millimeters per year, have been sinking 5 millimeters per year. This is not a prediction. This is what they found. Are areas with population centers such as New York City, Long Island, Baltimore, and Virginia Beach, and Norfolk are seeing areas of rapid subsidence, which is sinking land. Okay. Alongside more slowly sinking or relatively stable ground, increasing the risk to roadways, runways, building foundations, rail lines, and pipelines, according to a study published today. So on its PNAS nexus, I think is how you pronounce it, PNAS, and then nexus. So according to one of the authors, we're going to get the name here. It's Professor Geological Survey, I think. I may have butchered that name. I apologize. It's associate professor at Virginia Tech's Earth Observation and Innovation Lab. It says continuous unmitigated subsidence, which is the sinking, on the U.S. East Coast should cause concern. It goes on to say this is particularly in areas with a high population and property density and a historical complacency towards infrastructure maintenance. So a lot of, old cities where maintenance isn't really done as often. The team pulled together a vast collection of data points measured by space-based radar satellites and used this highly accurate information to build digital terrain maps that now show exactly where sinking landscapes present risks to the health of vital infrastructure. We're not talking about health of people. We're talking about the infrastructure here. This is all the things that would be damaged from flooding and storm surges, looking at residences, looking at, as they mentioned, airports, highways, roadways, railways, all these types of things that cost a ton of money to fix and maintain in the first place. And now with sinking land beside it, this could be, billions, if not trillions of damage over the number of years in the future that this happens. So they used the publicly available satellite imagery and measured millions of occurrences of land subsidence spanning multiple years. Then they created some of the world's first high-resolution depictions of the land subsidence, so of the sinking of the land. So these new maps show that a large area of the East Coast is sinking at least 2 millimeters per year, with several areas along the mid-Atlantic coast of up to 3,700 square kilometers or 1,400 square miles, sinking more than 5 millimeters per year, more than the current 4 millimeter per year global rate of sea level rise. So it's sinking while the ocean's rising. That's really what it means. So they measured, Cersei goes on to say, we measured subsidence rates of 2 millimeters per year, affecting more than 2 million people and 800,000 properties on the East Coast. We know to some extent that the land is sinking. Through this study, we highlight that sinking of the land is not an intangible threat. It affects you and I and everyone, and it may be gradual, but the impacts are real. So in several cities along the East Coast, multiple critical infrastructures, such as roads and railways, airports, and levees, which are extremely important. We know that from Hurricane Katrina, are affected by differing subsidence rates. So here, the problem is not just that the land is sinking. The problem is that the hotspots of sinking land intersect directly with population and infrastructure hubs. So for example, significant areas of critical infrastructure in New York, including JFK and LaGuardia airports and its runways, along with the railway system, are affected by subsidence rates exceeding 2 millimeters per year. The effects of these right now and into the future are potential damage to infrastructure and increased flood risks. So just imagine your, flights that can't get out of two of probably the biggest airports in the U.S. On a regular basis. That's going to cost a lot of money. We're not talking about lives at risk here, maybe in some areas, but at this point, we're talking about, this study really looks at infrastructure. So, these are the things that when you look at sort of natural land, or even just, it could be due to construction or development of some sort, and then you combine that with climate change and sea level rise and increased storm surges and increased storm, intensity of these storms, you are getting to a point where things are going to get nasty. Things are going to get damaged, and the money we have to invest in just upgrading our infrastructure, moving our infrastructure, is insane. Now, one thing I should mention, one of a good buddy of mine and colleague of mine, Dr. Andrew Thaler, has been getting together and like, it was sitting on a committee. He's even mentions this in one of the podcasts that we did together, and I'll link that in the show notes below. But he did something where he was like, yeah, I started to join our climate change committee, or formed a climate change committee. And he said, you would be amazed at how tough it is to just increase things or move a road or increase the level of a road. It's ridiculous how difficult it can be and how much goes into it and how expensive it is to change things. So imagine doing this in a larger city, where government has to pay even more to be able to do that. This is not something that is going to change overnight. This is something that we have to look at it. And he says, Patrick Bernard, a research geologist with the USGS and co-author of the study, says, this information is needed. No one else is providing it. So Cersei and his Virginia Tech team stepped into this niche with his technical expertise and is providing something extremely valuable. And this is going to be potentially like huge for Cersei's career, but something that really needs to be looked at by cities, major cities on the U.S. Atlantic coast, because this is just going to get worse. And if you look at areas where we know that sea level rise is going to really affect, like southern Florida, this is even going to be a bigger issue, right? And so if you go onto the link, if you click the link in the show notes to go onto this phys.org article, you'll see a vertical land motion, sort of like a map of the areas where, how much is sinking millimeter per year. And, you get certain areas that are okay, and you get certain areas that are really bad. And a lot of them are in between. And that's something that could be very dangerous. Looking at Virginia, Norfolk, Delaware, those areas are pretty bad. You're looking at Georgia, South Carolina, just north of Jacksonville, Florida. These places are pretty bad. And areas, just in Florida, small areas just in Florida. So this is where the land is sinking. It has nothing to do with sea level rise. And just imagine if you combine that with as the sea levels are rising every year, you're looking at some pretty major issues here along the East Coast. So I wanted you to be aware of that. I know it's not a great way to start off the week to learn about this, but this is an important paper and potentially, the beginning of what a lot of cities along the East Coast have to take into account, and cities everywhere have to take into account when they are looking at infrastructure and looking at updating infrastructure. Just like how we talk about marine protected areas and how we have to change the way we design marine protected areas to protect areas for climate that will be more resilient towards climate change compared to areas that are less, we're not going to protect an area that may be destroyed by climate change consequences. We want to protect one that's resilient towards climate change consequences. That will play a role in there. And then you have with infrastructure, you might have to look at areas of prioritizing, updating infrastructure based on these maps, where areas are sinking a little bit more than others. And there could be a potential risk to infrastructure changes or infrastructure damage, which costs a lot of money. That's taxpayers' money. That's going to affect each and every one of us. Right. And also the way we use these areas, these sort of infrastructure services, railways, airports, highways, roadways, and so forth. Right. So this is something to consider. I'd love to hear what you think of this episode. Please feel free to drop me a DM on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. Or you can email me by going to speakupforblue.com/contact. Fill out the form. It's really easy to do. It goes right to my email. I'll answer you as soon as I can. But I would love to hear from you. Especially this year, I really want to increase that engagement. I'm getting a lot of engagement, but I would really love to increase it even more. So feel free to reach out any way you can. I'd be more than happy to engage because this is the beginning of a conversation, folks, and this is where I want to be there. So I want to be there. And if you want to be more involved and more aware of what's going on, you can sign up to my newsletter. It's not hard to do. All you have to do is go to speakupforblue.com and just go /newsletter. Speakupforblue.com/newsletter will get you into our newsletter and there's jobs that I post, there's new articles that I post, and every once in a while I put in some of my thoughts on certain things. So I would love to hear from you as soon as possible and get you signed up to that newsletter. All right. So thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.